let's move into the main topic. Let's talk about .NET 7. And what is the .NET 7 release all about? Well, it's about essentially the same things that .NET 5 and .NET 6 have been about. So I've been using this slide for the last 2 years of .NET presentations. It's the one .NET vision. One .NET means everything .NET should be the same, should be available everywhere. We started this journey with .NET Core 1.0 more than 7 years ago at this point, I believe, or possibly even older with the early internal stuff. The idea with .NET Core was to rebuild .NET from the ground up with the cloud in mind, with hyperscalability in mind, lightweight development in mind, pick and choose rather than one box, one machine that has everything installed that you could possibly ever need, and then running on top of that. We are thinking about containerized scenarios, pick and choose small images that run in virtualized cloud scenarios, or even on a local desktop. You might want to run things that are highly optimized just in small packages. We're talking about mobile development. We're talking about IoT devices, all those types of things. So that's what started with .NET Core. And if you want to think of it that way, it was a reimagining of .NET from the ground up with performance and scalability and nimbleness in mind. I think that the word nimbleness always sums it up pretty good for me. Now that was cool, but it also took us away from just having a .NET that could run everything we wanted to run. And so we had Core, we had the regular full framework .NET. And so bringing this all back together, where you could just build a .NET code base and regardless of what you build, it would run everywhere. That became the one .NET vision. And the original goal was to ship that with .NET 5. Microsoft came a long way with that, but due to a variety of circumstances, including the pandemic, it didn't quite work out where they did it all. So then we had .NET 6 last year, and .NET 6 delivered largely on that particular idea. But I say largely wasn't complete, and so there were a few things like .NET MAUI, which we'll talk about here today, was missing from that picture, and then just a few other odds and ends, and then we had the whole new Blazor development framework, and just stuff that grew and was ready to be shipped and fairly complete in 5, and then in 6 it was rather complete, and now in .NET 7 what we have is another iteration on that. So it's very much what you'd expect it to be. Lots and lots of added features, lots and lots of optimizations, but nothing breaking, nothing earth-shattering, nothing from the ground up so different that your code wouldn't work. So one early takeaway from this presentation here is .NET 7 is very easy to move to. You shouldn't have to make any code changes. Your thing should just run. If you haven't moved on to .NET 5 or 6 yet, .NET 7 should make it even easier to convert into that world. So long story short, people always ask, well, should I upgrade to this version? And the answer is there's probably no reason that I could think of, at least, why you wouldn't want to move on to that version. So what's included in this one.NET? And we still keep calling it one.NET, by the way, because that used to be the code name for it. What's included is everything that was the .NET framework in the past, so what we now call the legacy framework or the full framework. It's everything that we used to call .NET Core. The term .NET Core is still around. You'll see things like Entity Framework Core and things of that nature. So it's still being used. In general, for .NET, we just now call it .NET 6, .NET 7, and it's understood that that's built on the Core platform. So that's included in that one.NET vision. Everything that came from the Mono side and Xamarin, so the mobile development, iOS, Android is included. And then also other technologies we had in the past that were to some extent still supported. Okay. I think I talked about that enough, so let's move along. Now let's take a look at the roadmap. And the roadmap, again, is also one of those things that I've had on my slides for quite a while now in an almost unchanged fashion, because it's been very predictable. And predictability has been a big goal of the .NET timeline and roadmap. So every year in November, we have a .NET release. So .NET 7 is going to be released a few days from now on November 8th. So just 10 days from now, that'll come out for real. Right now, we're still on a preview version. So all the demos you'll see me do here today are still preview, but we're literally just a few days away. And I certainly encourage you to start playing with that right away. Now, what that means also is it's not just a release where, okay, .NET is now available, but it also means all the things like Azure are now updated to that. So when you go onto Azure and you build, let's say, an app service or an Azure function, your expectation should be that the .NET 7 or whatever the release is at that point, that those versions are also available in all these deployed scenarios. In other words, Microsoft wouldn't consider it a .NET 7 release if .NET 7 wasn't available on all the Microsoft offerings. Okay, so we'll have stable, very predictive releases. Minor releases happen in between, which is, I think, important because we don't want to lose that kind of agility and nimbleness either. So for instance, as I already mentioned before, the Maui mobile app development stuff that we'll talk about today wasn't quite ready with the .NET 6 release last year. It was available in preview, but not released, but it came out during the year. Now, we kind of now consider it part of .NET 7, but it was actually available and supported several months ago. So minor releases in between, and you can expect this to continue going forward. So next year, we'll have another state of .NET focusing on .NET 8, and it'll also be around November 8th, 9th, 10th, something like that, the way it's always been, and that'll continue going forward as well. We're also in this back and forth cycle of long-term support releases and general availability releases. They're both supported releases, and we'll talk about that in a few slides, but the long story short is LTS releases have a long support cycle. General availability releases are supported for 15 months. And the idea is you can always update to an LTS version very, very easily. So if you were on .NET 5 and then .NET 6 came out, well, it was easy to just flip the switch and go to .NET 6. And that's always the expectation. And it's kind of true for .NET 7. If you were on 6, you can flip the switch, go to 7. I've not seen any scenarios that are incompatible. And the same will be true again for .NET 8. So it's some people always say, oh, well, it's not an LTS release. Should I go to it? And my answer always is yes, you still should, because it's so easy to move along. Okay, there's a question online about legacy conversion. Hold that question. We'll get to that very specifically today. So as I'm doing this presentation here today, we are on the .NET 7 preview. You can download that right now. Very, very complete. Like I said, the official release is November 8th. Along with that, always also comes a new release of Visual Studio. Those are now in lockstep as well. We are in the preview 5 version now. I think it just came out literally this morning. Last non-released version of Visual Studio, I suppose. We'll hear more about that November 8th, but that's always the expectation. And that's been something, I use that as my main development environment. Very, very stable, highly recommended. But technically, this stuff isn't coming out until November 8th. So let's talk a little more about this LTS versus general availability. General availability means, okay, it's done, it's released, it's available now, Microsoft supports it, but the support cycle, like I said, is 15 months only. Now, don't confuse that with it's not supported. Sometimes the decision makers, the bosses freak out. It's like, oh, are you using unsupported stuff? No, it is supported. It just won't be supported as long. And it's just a logistical thing because it's very, very difficult for Microsoft to support all these different versions for a long time. So instead, it makes more sense to do something like you release a .NET 5, it's GA, 15-month support. That gives you some overlap with .NET 6. Go into .NET 6 is then very easy. Flip the switch, go over, and now you have your same code base supported for a long time. Now, does that mean that everything we've done in .NET 5, we panic about that this time of year and switch it over to .NET 6? Honestly, no, we don't. It's just one of those things. If I go into, say, a microservice that we've built in .NET 5 and I make a minor change and I see it's .NET 5, I take it to .NET 6. Now, you're going to say, oh, well, that's very uncontrolled and Wild West. And I suppose in a way it is, but it really has been where you can flip that switch and it just works. There just aren't big enough changes to break it in what's already there. There's new things, but the stuff just keeps working. And I have not had any problems with that. I've not heard of anyone having problems with that. So that's what we do. But if we have services that are still on 5 and they keep running and it's no problem, we don't panic over it, and we just let them run, and that's fine. So anyway, .NET 7 is a general availability release, will be supported into, I guess, early 2024. But the last LTS release is .NET 6. Now that has some interesting implications. Like Microsoft themselves understands that some people don't want to move because of this perception. And so Microsoft targets .NET 6 as a minimum version for a lot of things that are going on. So as an example, we'll talk about Entity Framework a little bit today, the latest version of that, which is part of the .NET 7 release. But you can use this release of Entity Framework back to .NET 6, which was the LTS release, and that works as well. And that's true for a fair number of technologies there. So if you were indeed stuck in the .NET 6 world, but wanted to use things like Entity Framework 7 or Core WCF or any of those, that actually still works without a problem. So that's nice to know. Okay, another slide I've now used a few times, just giving you an overview of what's included in this unified .NET platform. All these different things here that we are showing, from WinForms and WPF to the web, to the cloud, to mobile devices, to even the gaming guys, and of course AI and more, is all now on one platform. So if you're building a .NET 7 class library, let's say, you can expect it to work in all those things. Now, of course, you could go out of your way and do things that are just unusual, like talking to a specific Windows service, for instance. Well, that would then not work on iOS because you just use something platform specific. But in general, everything you do in .NET should work in all these platforms. Question online is, what about NuGet packages that are still targeting Core or .NET Standard and so on? All of these will keep working. Okay, so no reason to be concerned about that. Then another question is, will there be a version 4.9? In other words, will the legacy framework, the full framework, whatever you want to call that, receive an update that goes from 4.8 to 4.9? And that's a no. That will not happen. The only thing that will happen on the old platform is critical security patches, that type of stuff. So it's supported in that sense, but it's not further developed in the sense that there'll be a lot of new features. Now, if you are stuck on something like WinForms on 4.8, you're like, well, that's really bad. What am I going to do with that? Well, the good news is further development is happening on the .NET 7 platform, and that includes developments that'll help you move to .NET 7. So if you have a WinForms app, the good news is you can probably run that on .NET 7 now, and it'll be faster, more secure, get all the benefits, all the new APIs that are coming out. And so you're not in a dead end. Your world continues, but it doesn't continue on the old stack, the old technology. So kind of makes sense in a way. You're moving forward to get the new stuff, not the old stuff. Another question here is, can you use the .NET 7 compilation to target other .NET targets without any issue? So I'm not sure what he means exactly by other .NET targets, but you could target, for instance, .NET 5 with this, or .NET Standard, and certainly that would absolutely work. In fact, some of the things like the C# compiler do a lot of things that are not, it's not true for everything, but they do a lot of things that are not platform or version specific. So it's actually possible to say, I want to use the latest C# compiler, but I want to compile for .NET 5, let's say. And then a lot of things will just work. So that's nice to know. Here's another slide that I wanted to pop up. I haven't had an updated version of this slide. I'm always a little bit dependent on Microsoft to give me an updated version of this. Is actually a little bit older. But the point is, the .NET ecosystem is very, very healthy. It's very fast growing. There's a lot of developers that are using .NET, not just occasionally, but as their day-to-day main development platform. C#'s always among the top 5 languages on GitHub. Performance is great, and so on and so on. We're getting a little better with the students. And so I was hoping to have an updated slide here. This is outdated. You can probably up all those numbers a little bit. Probably looks a little better today than it looks on these slides. But I'm just depending on Microsoft to give me these slides. But the point remains, it's a very, very good place to be. There's a lot of momentum, a lot of people getting into it, and just kind of a cool overall situation. All right, well, what are the major things that are going on in .NET 7? One of the major things is performance. Now you're going to say, oh, performance. Again, we've heard that for, I don't know how many versions now. Well, it's always there in every version. But .NET 7 is becoming a mature version of .NET. Again, .NET 5 was kind of the revolutionary one. 6 kind of finished that story. And 7 is now ironing out all the kinks, if you want to think of it like that. And the quote-unquote kinks are performance, right? So ever since .NET Core, performance has been a major theme. The whole idea of doing .NET Core was to make it smaller and more lightweight and faster. And then every version since then has improved. But in .NET 7, it's a fairly major part. And in fact, for the first time in my State of .NET, I'll actually show you a fairly sizable performance demo here in a moment. The other thing is simplification and productivity. So the things that are going on, say, in the compilers, mostly revolve around this idea of making you more productive. What are the things developers have to do that they do all the time, and how to make those things easier? So simpler, more productive is a big theme here. The things that .NET does, making them easier to do rather than adding major new things to it. We want to enable developers to build modern applications, whether that is a web app, whether that's a cloud native app, whether that's a modern desktop application. And there's several ways now to build desktop apps. So that's kind of cool, having modern apps, but not just building modern apps from scratch. A big theme also is taking existing apps and moving them into this new platform. So the question that was online before around, well, what do I do with my 4.8 app and how do I move that forward? And there's another question coming in right now. Could I take a 12-year-old WinForm app and compile it this week? .NET 7, will that just work? I'm not sure if it'll just work. Chances are yes, but in Windows apps you can do very low-level stuff, call into Windows APIs that may not just work out of the box, but chances are it'll work very well. And chances are that there's going to be a good tool that Microsoft provides you, whether it's the upgrade and migration tooling story or something else, that'll tell you exactly what you need to do and what to expect so you can analyze your project ahead of time. So making it possible to take older apps and making them more modern is a big theme in that. Then another question is, what about web forms? We'll get to that. Web forms is not as such supported, but there's now some help with that as well. So that's cool. Now, of course, cloud native apps, that's always a topic that's there. And when you look at what Microsoft does, is cloud is the number one thing that they care about. That's where their business is, especially enterprise cloud apps, but also smaller. So it goes without saying that every new version of Visual Studio, every new version of .NET focuses on making it easy for you to build something in the cloud. And therefore, when Microsoft builds new services in the cloud or enhances existing services, the tooling around that and the platform to build on, of course, Visual Studio and .NET have a big part to play in that. But it's also beyond that, because it's not just .NET, it's whatever you want to run on the cloud. So those are the themes that are there. Now, if you wanted me to sum this up in one sentence, I would say we have a mature system. The building blocks have all been there. The major things have all been there. It's just been about making things better, smoother, faster, easier. So nothing disruptive. I would not expect to have a .NET 5, a .NET 6 app, or even older apps, but especially that generation. There's no reason to not move into .NET 7. It's a very, very, very straightforward thing. Most likely you open your project, you change the target version to .NET 7, and it should just work. That's my expectation for anything that's been built in the last few years. So again, no reason to not go to .NET 7 if you're in that boat. Now, side note, Visual Studio, again, things are now developing in lockstep. Visual Studio now coincides with the .NET releases to support that. Visual Studio 2022 17.4 is currently available as a preview. Like I said, just this morning, I noticed there was another preview build, and this will release soon. I use that for all my development. Even when I target something older, I use the preview versions of Visual Studio and have really not had many problems with that unless I do something truly out of the ordinary. So again, encourage you to do that. By the way, you can install different versions of Visual Studio at the same time. So you can use 17.3, which is the prior released version. I have that installed as well as 17.4, and those work side by side. Now, I guess DevBox will make that even easier in the future, but it also works on a local machine. Question online, how about Azure DevOps Server Roadmap? I don't have a lot of time to talk about Azure DevOps here today, but just to quickly answer that question, Azure DevOps will be around for a long time to come. The main reason for that always makes the most sense for me, is Microsoft internally is very, very dependent on DevOps and the Azure DevOps services. We use DevOps as our backbone for our development and our custom software and consulting practice for the most part, right? So that's kind of what we've bet on, and we'll continue to bet on for a lot of stuff we're doing. And it's very important for Microsoft to not anger enterprises that use all that stuff, of course. So if you're on that platform for your DevOps story, don't you worry, that'll be around for a long time to come. Now, is that going to be where all the cool new stuff happens, where all the AI stuff happens, all these new features? No, that's going to be on GitHub. So if I was to start up a DevOps story today, I will probably use GitHub, and we're starting to do that for new projects. But I'm not nervous about the DevOps stuff that we have in Azure DevOps so far.